In early 1993, Grateful Dead archivist Dick Latvala was working from a short list. Kid Candelario, a longtime member of the Grateful Dead's road crew, had asked him to name the 3 strongest 2-track recordings in the entire vault. So the idea of an official release, what would become Dick Picks Volume 1, could be brought to the band. Latvala settled on 3 nights, December 19, 1973, at Curtis Hickson Convention Hall in Tampa, February 13, 1970 at the Fillmore East in New York, and October 11, 1977 at the Lloyd Noble Center in Norman, Oklahoma. He later described choosing among them as involving extreme pressure. Sure, the Dead had released archival material before, including Bear's Choice from Bear's original 2-track tapes, and more recently, 1 from the vault and 2 from the vault, built from multi-tracks. But they had never built an ongoing series around a vast collection of 2-track tapes still sitting in the vault. What Dick was proposing made it completely different, because a 2-track soundboard tape, largely locked into the mix made that night, offered to the public close to how it was actually captured. He picked Tampa. Late 1973 had other strong nights he could have chosen instead, and he knew it. What tipped him towards that date was a single performance inside of it. Here Comes Sunshine, which he later named as one of the decisive attractions of that show. Dead.net decided to release the Tampa concert on Halloween, October 31st, 1993, with the name Dick's Pick Volume 1. But the decision itself happened months earlier, in a room with 3 tapes and a choice that never had to be made before. Let me share why that's so important. Latvala wasn't deciding which Grateful Dead concerts existed on tape. A tape trading network had circulated recordings for years by then, and a serious collector could already hear hundreds of shows without paying the band or its organization a simple $1. What Dick was deciding was narrower and stranger. Which of those recordings would carry the band's own endorsement? Which would be mastered, packaged, sold, and treated from then on as part of the Grateful Dead's official record? A fan who'd spent 2 decades arguing about tapes for free was now the person choosing what the Grateful Dead itself would call its history. Dick Latvala was born in 1943 and raised in Berkeley, California. He identified his big moment as January 21st through 23rd, 1966, the Trips Festival at Longshoremen's Hall in San Francisco, as the first Grateful Dead performance he could clearly remember attending. He'd taken part in a legal LSD research project in Menlo Park shortly before, and he later connected that experience and the music to the direction the rest of his life was going to take. By 1972, he was keeping detailed diaries about the shows, and he kept them for years. His notebooks showed something that separated him from most fans who write things down in the moment. He went back and he revised. A show he'd praised at the time might get a second look years later, and a second opinion too. His notes on the Cornell show from May 8, 1977, recorded that night by Betty Cantor Jackson, are a clean example. Weeks after the concert, he called it the best show of the year he'd heard so far. He came back to it years later and praised it again, just as strongly, a judgment that eventually be ratified by the Library of Congress, which inducted that recording into the National Recording Registry in 2011. That recording is one of the Betty boards, Cantor Jackson's own soundboard masters, some of the best recordings the Dead had ever made, which went missing for nearly 3 decades after a 1986 storage auction and passed hand to hand through the same tape trading world Dick came from. He'd listen, judge, revise, and change his mind when the evidence called for it. That was the method, long before anyone at the Grateful Dead's offices even knew his name. While he was living in Hawaii through the 70s, he built relationships with tape traders on the mainland through letters and small publications, trading blank reels and copies back and forth. His wife Carol later remembered him sending cannabis along with those packages, which just tells you something about how informal and trust-based that whole network was, right? He also held listening gatherings. One of them marked the anniversary of the February 1970 Fillmore East shows, material that eventually became Dick Pics Volume 4 more than 2 decades later. There's a recording from 1975 that captures him arguing with another deadhead who thought the band had gotten less interested. Latvalia's answer wasn't to defend the band, it was to say he felt responsible for meeting the band where they currently were, rather than demanding that they match some earlier version of themselves. That idea that every era has to be judged on its own terms followed him into the job he didn't even have yet. By 1978, Dick had become friendly with members of the Grateful Dead's crew. He started visiting the band's offices more often, usually with a tape he thought someone on the staff really needed to hear. Carol, his wife, remembered him pushing Phil Lesh directly. He wasn't the first person to try and organize it. A Grateful Dead employee named Willie Legate had already built an early catalog of the vault. An official Grateful Dead archivist, David Lemieux, has described Legate as an early archivist in practice, even if that wasn't his official title or role. Latvala didn't walk into an empty room. The organization hired him in 1985 to go through the vault systematically, listen to what was there, and compare tape contents against the labels and boxes to figure out what the Grateful Dead actually owned and had. It wasn't a curator's job quite yet. Carol remembered the less glamorous side of it too, that early on he was the new guy on the block who would get sent out for coffee and sandwiches. What he found inside the vault came in different forms, and the difference really mattered. Multitracks could be remixed, giving engineers enormous control over balance and sound. A 2-track soundboard tape was largely locked into the mix made that night. It could still be mastered and edited, but nobody could reach inside it later and turn Jerry up or bury a bad vocal. Sure, the Grateful Dead had released archival material before Dick's Pics. Bear's Choice, released in 1973, came from Bear's original 2-track tapes recorded 3 years earlier and was reshaped into a tribute to Ron Pigpen McKiernan after his death that year. One from the vault in 1991 and 2 from the vault in 1992 came from multitracks, with far more control over the final mix. What hadn't happened yet was an ongoing series built around the vault's 2-track material. Tapes that couldn't be remixed, but might still be musically essential. Dick Pics would treat those 2-track tapes as releasable on their own terms, on the idea that a performance's importance could outweigh the limits to how it was recorded. Many Dick Pics later would be shipped with a printed warning calling it caveat emptor, alerting buyers to exactly those source limitations. That would be the standard Dick was building toward before anyone had agreed to even let him build it. The series would run from that first Tampa volume in 1993 all the way through volume 36 in 2005, long after Dick was gone. Peter McQuaid worked in the Grateful Dead merchandising, and when he arrived, he was told the remaining vault material wasn't considered good enough to be released. Then, imported bootleg CDs started showing up. Entire multi-disc Italian sets, professionally pressed and sold without the band seeing $1 from it. McQuaid remembers Kid Candelario, or Latvala, bringing him a box of 20 to 30 of these sets. McQuaid carried them into the band meeting, laid them on the table, and made the case. Outsiders were already profiting off these concerts, so the organization should put out something better itself. He says the band approved the idea within 3 minutes, and that Dick, who was in the room, was absolutely ecstatic. That's McQuaid's recollection given years later. So treat the exact staging of that meeting as his memory of it, rather than some documented transcript. But the shape of the story holds up against everything else in the record. If the Grateful Dead did put out its own version of its history, somebody else, they were already doing it. At the start of 1993, Kid Candelario went to Dick with a request. He needed the 3 best 2-track shows in the vault, so he could bring the idea of an official 2-track release to the band itself. In an interview with David Gans that October, Latvala said flatly that the whole concept had been Kid's idea, not his. He was the one with the ear. He wasn't the one who thought to ask the question. That's the room this story keeps circling on back to. A crew member with an idea. A merchandising executive watching Italian bootleggers sell the band's own concerts, while the official vault stayed largely behind closed doors. And a fan turned employee holding a short list he'd spent years building the judgment to make. Half it didn't happen because Latvala decided one day that he had the authority to choose the Grateful Dead's official history. No. It happened because the people around him decided he already earned that right. Steve Silberman had a phrase for what Dick Latvala was inside the Grateful Dead organization. He called him a double agent. Dick had spent decades inside a culture built on free trading and word of mouth, and he never fully left it, even after the band started signing his paychecks. Some tapes in the Grateful Dead archive still carry the warning, courtesy of Dick Latvala, do not circulate. Those labels capture the contradiction perfectly. David Gans, who worked closely with Dick for years, separately remembered him sometimes providing copies of the vault material to collectors himself. That's not the same as saying he was stealing from the vault. His loyalties just ran in two directions, and the job repeatedly put those loyalties in direct conflict. In a 1995 interview with Silberman, Dick said getting more vault music into the world was his mission. He wanted 3 or 4 archival releases a year. And in the same conversation, he said something that cuts directly against the image of him as a gatekeeper with total control. He said, "I'm not in charge," and he meant that. The selection process ran through John Cutler, who had been the Dead's longtime sound engineer, Jeffrey Norman, Kid Candelario, and the band members themselves who kept the ability to say no. He wasn't only negotiating with people inside the building, he was being judged by his group, by Deadheads, the same community he had grown up in. Fans argued online about which shows deserved release and which eras were being ignored. And by most accounts, the constant criticism wore on him over time. He'd say it himself years earlier. "I want input all the time. Give me input and I will make decisions." He got the input. Whether he wanted quite that much of it, maybe that's a different question. Dick Latvala died on August 6, 1999 of a heart attack. He was 56 years old. 14 Dick Picks volumes had been released while he was alive. The series continued after him, reaching 36 volumes by 2005, released by people he'd worked alongside for years. But eventually, it stopped being fair at some point to call every one of those releases his personal choice. Dave Lemieux joined the organization early 1999 and worked closely with Latvala for only about 3 or 4 months before his death. It wasn't a long apprenticeship, but in that short window, Dick played him the September 8th, 1973 show at Nassau Coliseum more than once, and walked him through why individual songs mattered and how to listen to it critically. Dave later called it one of the best played shows from one of the Grateful Dead's best years. In 2021, that show became Dave's Picks Volume 38, and the release was marketed as carrying a double endorsement, Lemieux's and Latvala's, both. Dick's notebooks and recordings eventually found a permanent institutional home at UC Santa Cruz Grateful Dead Archive, where his listening notes sit alongside the broader collection of the band's history, fan materials, correspondence, and the kind of detailed show diaries he'd been keeping since 1972. 22 years after Dick died, his judgment about a single Long Island concert from 1973 was still influencing what came out of the Grateful Dead's archive. He used to say all the shows have their aspects of greatness. Somebody still had to pick which ones got heard. That's Dick Latvala's story. I was born after the band had already come together, so some of what I know about their live shows, particularly through the 70s, I know because somebody decided a tape was worth saving and putting out. Cornell 77 is one of my favorites. And it says something that the same show Dick was raving about in his notebook back in 1977 is still the one people point to as the best. I wouldn't have that show or a lot of others without people like him. So I say thank you.